walking virtually along the world's most revered footpaths and connecting the global community of pilgrims. It's the Sacred Steps Podcast, available on YouTube and your favorite podcast app. Broadcasting from the Shaymare Studios in Florida, here's your host, pilgrim, backpacker, and author, Kevin Donahue.
Buen Camino, pilgrims, and welcome back to the Sacred Steps Podcast. I'm Kevin Donahue. On today's episode, we're discussing the Camino de Santiago with American pilgrim Brian Stewart. But before we begin, I want to share a little inside information on our show. First, the podcast is returning to its regular bi-monthly format in November 2021. So if you're not already subscribed, I hope you'll press subscribe on your podcast app or YouTube so that our episodes will be available to you automatically twice every month. Next, we're wrapping production on the final episodes of Season 2. And this is just crazy to me. We've begun recording episodes for Season 3 of the podcast. If you're interested in appearing with me on the show, please drop me a note at sacredstepspodcast.com or on our Facebook page, both of which are linked with all of the information from today's episode in the show notes below. Lastly, speaking of insider information, you can join our email newsletter for updates and timely insights on my pilgrimages, notes from the show, and more at sacredstepspodcast.com. Next up, we've got a question from a listener in South Africa, Stephanie. She writes, Kevin, love the show. On the last episode, you mentioned Camino video tips. Where can I listen to those? Buen Camino from Jayberg. Thanks, Stephanie. You'll find all of our Camino 101 videos on YouTube at youtube.com/sacred steps. A few of the Camino tip videos touch on apps for the Camino, how many days to walk the journey, how much does it cost to walk the Camino, and what's the difference between albergues, donativos, and hotels. All in all, I believe there are about 12 to 15 short videos, approximately 5 minutes in length, to help you start your Camino. You can find that at youtube.com/sacred steps, or just go to YouTube and search for Camino 101 or search for Sacred Steps. Thanks for the email, Stephanie. Buen Camino from Florida. Earlier this summer, I sat down with American pilgrim Brian Stewart to talk about his incredible journey along the Camino de Santiago. Bryan, who has a very rare form of muscular dystrophy called Becker Muscular dystrophy, walked the entirety of the Camino Francaise route from Saint-Jean-de-Pied-de-Port on the French border, over the Pyrenees on the Napoleon route, and across the entirety of Spain. While many, if not most, pilgrims face challenges along the Camino, on his very first day, Bryan struggled just to walk up the road to the pilgrim's office. Along the route, Bryan fell hundreds of times, at one point snapping the walking sticks he needed to travel safely. Across stairways and rockier passages, Bryan crawled. Step by exhausting step, Bryan made his way to Santiago de Compostela, and he's here with us today to share his inspiring story. Bryan's story opened my eyes to the challenges that many pilgrims with disabilities face along the Camino de Santiago, and how much work is still needed to open the Camino to pilgrims of all abilities. If you're dreaming of walking the Camino, but think the route is out of reach because of your circumstances, I hope Bryan's story will inspire you to rethink all that is possible. I can tell you that it has prompted me to reflect on how we define physical strength, and how Bryan, like many who overcome so much to reach Santiago, can inspire us all. Brian Stewart, welcome to the Sacred Steps Podcast.
Hey, Kevin. Thanks for having me on the show today.
I'm really excited to share your story because we connected back in February over your blog post and some shares that you had done in Facebook groups telling and relating your Camino story. So thank you for coming on today and sharing with our audience a little about your Camino de Santiago story. For those that aren't familiar with Brian, let's start at the very beginning. What inspired your Camino de Santiago pilgrimage?
Well, I think what it comes down to, I have a condition called Becker muscular dystrophy. It's a neuromuscular disease that causes my muscles to get weaker over time. And I have a very mild form of the condition, but as I get older, it's going to slowly make me walk slower. And eventually, when I'm in my later life, like 60s, I'll probably be in a wheelchair. So when I was a year out of college, I kind of realized that my condition was kind of progressing a little bit. I was having more trouble walking up steps, walking like really long distances, walking up hills. So I knew that another 5 years or so, maybe I couldn't do a big long hike somewhere. And I kind of knew about the Camino, so I figured that would be a good kind of hike that I could do that was still in my capability, that was still in my range of abilities.
So I have to be honest, and I know most of our audience might be in the same position that I am. I wasn't familiar with Becker muscular dystrophy. I was familiar with an organization here in the United States that supports research and aid for people who have various forms of muscular dystrophy, the MDA. That's an association in the United States devoted to research, and we'll link their organization in the show notes so you can get more information. But in using the MDA resource, I learned a little bit about Becker, and this is a pretty early onset form of muscular dystrophy, right? You started to develop symptoms as a boy.
Yeah, I had symptoms basically from about 3 years old onward, trouble walking up steps, hills, but I was finally diagnosed at 8 years old, and that kind of answered a lot of the questions about why I was having trouble keeping up with other kids my age and kind of just doing physical things.
One of the symptoms, and I think this may be related to age progression, also involves some cardiac repercussions. People suffer and may end up with a pacemaker. Without prying too much to your personal health, do you also have cardiac symptoms?
Not currently, but with Becker muscular dystrophy, sometimes you can be completely fine, and all of a sudden the heart will just kind of veer in another direction all of a sudden. So it's in the future I may have cardiac problems, which is something that I really can't plan for. It might happen at some point in my future.
Well, and all of us kind of go through that, right? We have health conditions that have a certain onset and affect us throughout our lives, and we don't really see those days coming. You have the benefit of actually knowing what some of the onset symptoms could be in your future. So you took this proactive step to walk the Camino de Santiago. Before you went, Brian, you shared in your blog, this wasn't your first long walk. You had actually been a walker and tried a pretty exciting journey here in the United States, right?
Yeah, I mean, I'd done a lot of like hiking and stuff on family vacations and like traveling I did in my 20s in college, like out west in Wyoming, Colorado, a lot of stuff around the East Coast. But my junior year of college, I was involved in this organization at my college. It was called STAND. It was the Society for Treatments and Awareness of Neuromuscular Diseases. And we organized this walk across New Jersey. It's about 50 miles from the Delaware River to the Atlantic Ocean. It was just kind of like this walk, just kind of to raise awareness for the club that we had at the college. And I did it with a close friend of mine. So that was my first like real like long walk that I did.
And so you set your sights on the Camino de Santiago. A lot of pilgrims walk the Camino, various routes and various lengths. Some start 100K from Santiago de Compostela. Some start a little further out. You took one of the more ambitious routes, the Camino Francaise, and you started at Saint-Jean-de-Pied-de-Port. Take us back to Saint-Jean, because I've read in your blog, and I'd love for you to tell us a little bit about your day zero story of arriving in Saint-Jean.
Yeah, that was an interesting day. So I got to Saint-Jean. Before I even started the Camino, the walk from the train station to the town, then up this steep road to the pilgrim's office to check in the night before. that road is like so steep. It was so slippery with all the cobblestone rocks. And I fell a couple times going up the road there. I was just like, how am I going to walk the Camino when I can't even walk up the road to check in the night before I even start the walk?
Did that,
And it was
I
just,
mean, that moment as you're sitting there saying that to yourself, I mean, second thoughts here?
yeah, it just felt like it was all a mistake. I'm like, why did I come here? There's no way I can cross the Pyrenees when I can't even walk up this road. And I started a blog for the MDA. I was writing them articles along the way. And I wrote an article the day before that they had posted, and it was like, everyone's watching this now, and like, I can't do this. How am I going to do this? Everyone's going to know that I was such a failure. It was just a really scary, like, this moment. Like, I just felt like it was all a mistake coming there.
Yeah. You get to the Pilgrim office, you get checked in, you find a place to sleep for the night?
Yeah, well, I didn't really have any plans when I got there. That's kind of a mistake on my part. I didn't really have reservations, but the lady who worked in the office there, she directed me across the street to this other lady's house. So she had a small hostel in the house where she let people stay. So it kind of all came together once I got there.
There's an expression the Camino provides. And for you, that first night, not having a place to stay and all the hostels being full, and then finally somebody making and arranging a bed for you, that was the first sign, I think, that the Camino was going to provide for you. And I hope that gave you some hope, because you tackled, and maybe this was because of your blogging for the MDA, but one of your goals was to do the full Camino and not to allow Becker or your mobility to impair your Camino. You said to yourself, I'm doing the Napoleon route.
Yeah, I was just like, I'm going to do this. I'm not going to let my condition prevent me from doing what I want to do. So I want to do the whole thing. I wanted to go over the Napoleon route. I wanted to walk all 500 miles. I wasn't going to let something stop me from reaching my goal.
First day out, for those that aren't familiar, the Camino Francaise, the walk from Saint-Jean-de-Pied-de-Port, probably the hardest single day on the Camino Francaise, right? Day one, you're going up, up, up. And what was that first day journey like for you?
It was like hitting a brick wall. Like, it was, and I got it. The walk down through town is kind of downhill, and then when you get out of town, just immediately uphill. And it was, all my training that I'd done beforehand was mostly on flat ground, so I hadn't really trained on, trails that steep. It was really intimidating. It was just, how am I going to make it over this? By just kind of just one step at a time, slowly just took my time, and that was all I could do.
I love that expression, one step, then another. You said those who have Becker often have trouble walking upstairs. And so obviously an incline is going to be difficult as well. Is that related to the physicality of just, lifting your legs and moving up in that motion and supporting weight? Or is it fatigue? Or what goes into your physical experience of walking that first day?
It's a little bit of both. Right now, and on the Camino, it mainly affects my quadricep muscles. That's the main spot where I have most difficulty. So it's like, as soon as my legs bend to walk uphill, like when I have to bend my leg to kind of put pressure on my quadriceps to walk up, that's when I really slow down. When I walk up hills, I kind of have to keep, I kind of like lock my legs in place when I walk uphill. So like the least bending that I can do with my leg when I'm going uphill is the easiest. So it just really tires out my quadriceps going uphill. So I really have to just go an inch at a time to slowly inch my way up. It's a little frustrating sometimes. You just want to go, but I can't go that fast. As
you're walking, you start out in the morning, and there's usually a good number of pilgrims who are making the journey. People are walking a little faster at times, a little slower at times. Did you find yourself interacting with any of those pilgrims along the way?
Yeah, well, when I first left St. Jean, I met up with, it was the mother and daughter from Norway who I started walking with. And they kind of walked slow with me, which was nice to have someone walk at my pace. But it's intimidating having people like just constantly passing you on the trail over and over and over, and you're just going so slow. So it's nice to have someone who's willing to walk at your pace with you.
You make an interesting point because you and I talked off show, and we've also had episodes with other pilgrims who have mobility impairments. And I can remember walking the Camino, and I can remember being on other pilgrimages and seeing people who were much faster than me, like you said, because I'm getting old. And I can remember seeing people who looked like they were in physical pain walking. And sometimes I would slow down and talk and walk. But I don't think I had any awareness that someone might have a physical disability that was impacting their Camino. What's it like being a pilgrim who has a mobility impairment and walking the Camino? And everyone's need is different. But in general, maybe you could share just your experience of disability accessibility along the Camino Francaise.
Another way of looking at it, I think that that didn't really define my journey, because everyone kind of has their own difficulties in the Camino. And people get blisters, people get injured other ways. So it didn't really make me, I think, that much different than other people on the Camino. And as far as accessibility, I mean, on a hike and trail, you can't go there expecting everything to be, accessible. I mean, I'm walking over mountains, so it's not going to be accessible. But I think Spain in general doesn't really have a lot of accessibility. Like a lot of the hostels and albergues I stayed in, if there were steps there, it was kind of a struggle. And every night I had to make sure I got to the albergue in time to get a bottom bunk, because climbing the ladder into the top bunk was very difficult for me. So that was a big factor in the Camino, having to get up every morning to get there to get a bottom bunk as quickly as I could. So that was a big factor in my Camino.
Wow, that is, that's like one of those instant takeaways where somebody says something and you're like, I don't know why I didn't think of that earlier. But I guess one of the things that I can do as a pilgrim, if I see somebody who has a greater need, is to give up that bottom bunk, right?
Yeah.
We talked with Justin Skizik, who you have corresponded with and worked with through the Muscular Dystrophy Association. And he shared that for pilgrims in wheelchairs, the Camino de Santiago is a very challenging, almost impossible endeavor until you get to about Sarria. Did you find along your route that as the Camino started to flatten out, or as there was different infrastructure, that the walk became more enjoyable for you?
Definitely. There's the whole middle section of the Camino, which is called the Meseta. That's pretty flat, so that was a pretty nice opportunity for me to kind of keep up with other pilgrims a little better and just kind of walk at kind of reasonable pace, not have to worry about, going over a lot of mountains and stuff. So that was nice in that section there. But other sections over the Pyrenees and when you enter Galicia and the mountains over there, that was kind of difficult. There's a couple sections there where I had to kind of crawl and drag my pack over some spots there where there's like a lot of boulders, or like a place where I had to walk over steps, or like step from rock to rock. That was what really challenged me, I think.
Our guest today is Brian Stewart. If you're not familiar with his story, we'll link in our show notes below his blog as well as his Muscular Dystrophy Association writings. So please check those out. One of the more touching stories in your blog that you've shared, and I thank you for sharing it, is your story of arriving at Cruz de Ferro. Can you take us back to that point on the Camino? You've been walking for days and days, and you're familiar either through your research and through conversations with pilgrims about the collective importance and impact of Cruz de Ferro. What was that experience like arriving for you?
Yeah, so that was a pretty difficult day for me. It's a real steep hill walking up to Cruz de Ferro. And I was really just kind of emotionally drained that day. It was a very, very tough day. But arriving at Cruz de Ferro, for people who don't know, Cruz de Ferro, it's a place where pilgrims, they leave behind a rock that they've brought with them from home. And the rock represents leaving behind a burden that you've carried from home onto the trail and dealt with throughout the journey. And for me, the closer I got to Cruz de Ferro, I thought more about my rock, and I realized that it's for me, like, what's my burden? It's having muscular dystrophy. It's not something that I can physically leave behind. That was with me the whole journey. That's going to be with me afterwards. It's not something I can leave behind. So, in my blog, I kind of wrote about how, the rock didn't necessarily have to represent leaving behind a burden. For me, it was kind of about swapping the rock for truth. That's what I wrote. It's about accepting what's real. The rock was kind of a memento of strength, and I wanted to leave behind, um, like, the idea of, that the rock was something that the burden was something I needed to let go of. That it was something instead, it was something that I could embrace, because having muscular dystrophy is going to be with me for the rest of my life. So I need to kind of embrace that. Otherwise, I'm going to be denying what my future is going to be.
Walking up and placing your rock at the cross was not an easy experience for you physically.
No, yeah, that's a tough walk up that pile there. My feet were kind of slipping on the rocks going up there. But finally being there, it was just a spiritual experience being at that moment on the Camino.
Yeah, I think that's a real common experience for pilgrims, in the release of a burden or acceptance, as you said, and gaining a strength because you're sort of accepting something as part of your life going forward. And I think that's a really powerful sentiment. Thanks for sharing that.
Yeah, yeah.
You experienced a bit of the Camino Spirit and the goodness and the generosity of pilgrims as you were walking. You had trouble with your walking stick, and you met a pilgrim who interjected themselves.
Yeah, so towards the end of the Camino, I was walking with a husband and wife from Florida, and I was walking with them. And on the Camino, I fell hundreds of times, so many falls I can't even count. But I was walking with them, and I fell this one time. And when I fell, I landed weird, and my walking stick, my walking pole, it broke. The whole metal shaft was completely bent. It's completely useless. And for me, a walking pole was really important for me. That really helps me get over difficult terrain. So I was just kind of like, what am I going to do? My pole is broken. How am I going to continue? But the guy I was with, a husband and wife, they each had a pole. And the husband, he gave me his pole. He's like, you need it more than me. Take it. So I left my old pole behind. I took his, and that helped me for the last little bit of the Camino there. But what makes that story interesting is the next day on the trail, I was walking. From behind me, another pilgrim comes up. He's using two hiking poles. He looks like he's really injured. And one of his poles is the red pole I left behind. He had fixed it. He had fixed the metal shaft, put it into place, and that was helping him on the trail. He needed two sticks, so that really helped him. And I think that kind of represented what the Camino is about. It just kind of everything kind of falls into place and works out for everyone.
Brian, let me ask you, there are people that you've mentioned throughout your blog and those you met along the way who became part of your Camino family, your tribe. Are you still in touch with any of those pilgrims today?
Oh yeah, a lot of them. Yeah, I keep in touch. We talk on Facebook, exchange emails every so often. There's quite a few that I still keep in touch with.
Your journey continues, and from Cruz de Ferro, we make our way all the way to Santiago de Compostela, and you arrive in front of the cathedral. What's that arrival in Santiago like after this kind of journey that had challenged you physically, emotionally, and drained you? And there you are in front of the cathedral.
I was kind of at a loss of words when I got there at the end. The day I got there, the day before, I had stopped a couple miles before Santiago in a small little town before there. So when I got to Santiago the next day, it was early in the morning. I was the only person there in the whole square. It was still dark, and it was just kind of just weird being there. It was just kind of at a loss of words. But I talk about in an article I wrote for a Camino website about how when I got there, I kind of wasn't really feeling like I got what I wanted in the Camino. I kind of had an unfulfilled feeling when I reached Santiago. Because when I got to Santiago, I was in a lot of pain. I wanted to there's a walk to Finisterre after you finish the Camino. I wanted to do that, but I was in a little bit of pain when I got there. So I stopped in Santiago. But I knew that I wanted to go back eventually and do that walk to Finisterre. So the next summer I went back to the Camino. I hiked the Portuguese Camino from Porto back up to Santiago. And from there I was planning on walking to Finisterre and then doing the trail up to Muxia. Then I was going to loop back to Santiago and then do part of the Camino Inglés, which is another trail. But when I finally reached Finisterre after going to Santiago in 2018, I got to the coast there and I kind of realized that I finally found that feeling of the Camino wasn't giving me everything that I wanted to get out of it. So when I reached Finisterre, I kind of realized that was the end for me. I realized that the Camino had given me what I wanted to get out of it. And that's kind of the feeling I was looking for, just knowing that I'd gotten everything that I wanted to get out of this experience.
So you've mentioned that you went back to the Camino the following year and did the Portuguese and you did the Camino Finisterre. And so I want to talk to you a little bit about, you're a young guy, right? You're hanging into your 20s, right? We haven't hit that 30 crossover yet.
Getting close, but not yet.
And you've spent a little time this year sharing stories and bringing focus to not only Becker but pilgrims with mobility impairments, talking about the Camino de Santiago through sharing your blog. You've shared your story on some of our podcasts and things like that. What are your next steps, Brian? What's ahead for you, either how it relates to the Camino specifically or some projects that you're working on?
Well, when I first finished Camino in 2017, I started writing up my experience. I had kept the journal, so I kind of used that to write up my experience afterwards. And I plan to write a book. I mean, I wrote a book. Well, I wrote a manuscript that I plan to turn to a book eventually. But a couple years after, I kind of struggled to find a publisher, find a writing agent. So it was this winter. I worked on my manuscript a lot this past winter, and I was kind of frustrated by it. I wasn't able to find a publisher. So a friend of mine was saying, you got to get that story out there, even if you can't find a publisher. So I decided to write a blog. I'm kind of chronicling my story in different posts. It's going to take a couple months before I finish typing up my whole story in there, but I just decided I just want to get my story out there to share it with people because it can be an inspiration to a lot of people.
I really appreciate you sharing it, and I hope that you will continue telling your story. Look forward to getting that book. I share your pain in writing. I had planned during COVID to be making some walks, and like many who have postponed their journeys, mine is still ahead of me. And so pages from my book are still unwritten, miles unwalked. Maybe both of us will find those books being published soon enough, and I look forward to reading that. Brian Stewart is our guest today on the Sacred Steps podcast. We'll link his blog and his story in the show notes below, so please click below if you want to hear more from Brian. Brian, in the brief time that we have left, what message would you share for those who are looking at your story and they're thinking about the Camino de Santiago or a walk that's meaningful to them, and they're saying to themselves, maybe what you said on day 0 in St. Jean, I'm not sure I can do this?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing I learned is kind of looking at your understanding of strength. Strength shouldn't be a comparison to other people. It shouldn't be about looking at someone else and thinking I want to be stronger than them, or I'm not strong enough compared to them. You have to kind of look at challenges from your own reference point, not look at strength as like a measure of, like a linear measure of how much, but it's more of a personal thing of just setting a goal on your own and just reaching that goal and making strength something personal, not a comparison to other people. I think that really helps with tackling a challenge like that, just knowing that it's your own thing that you're doing and you have to look at it from your own point of view.
Our guest today has been Brian Stewart, American Pilgrim. We'll link his blog and his upcoming book in our show notes below. Brian, thank you so much for being with us, my friend. Be well, stay safe, and buen camino.
Thank you. Buen camino, Kevin.
This has been the Sacred Steps Podcast. Visit sacredstepspodcast.com for episode notes, links, or to contact Kevin. Watch us online on YouTube. We read every comment. Please add your review and feedback. Before you go, tap subscribe to have episodes added to your playlist. Until next time, buen camino.